Now in office for the second time, Donald Trump has promised major changes to economic policy, among other things, including tariffs on foreign allies and enemies alike. He's paused his plans to impose tariffs of 25% on Mexican and Canadian goods. But for a tumultuous few days, North America appeared on the cusp of a trade war, a substantial departure from our typical relations with our two largest trading partners. Meanwhile, his tariffs of an additional 10% on all Chinese goods have taken effect, sparking immediate, targeted counter tariffs on a range of products and the launch of an antitrust investigation into Google from China. So what does all this mean for American industries and consumers? That's the big question. And here to make sense of these trade developments are three fellows from the Baker Institute whose work spans economic policy, energy, and foreign affairs, and who can speak to how President Trump's tariffs will impact markets, as well as our relationships with these trading partners. Ken Medlock is the director of the Center for Energy Studies. Tony Payan directs the Center for the U.S. and Mexico, and Steve Lewis is the CV Star Transnational China Fellow. I'm John Diamond, director of the Center for Tax and Budget Policy, and this is Baker Briefing. My name is John Diamond. We have a fascinating discussion tonight on tariffs. With myself as your moderator, you get three very distinguished fellows. We have Ken Medlock, the director of the Center for Energy Studies, Steve Lewis, the leader of the China Studies program, and Tony Payan, the director of the Center for the U.S. and Mexico. This is the trifecta of trade people that you want to talk to when you talk about trade issues. And why are we talking about trade issues? Well, it's been in the news just a few times recently as the new president in office for the second term has made several comments and started out his term with several executive orders on trade. Specifically, he imposed 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico and an additional 10% tariff on China within the last couple of weeks. Two of those were paused within the first Monday after he signed those orders, but it's still important. They're only paused for 30 days, and so we want to discuss all of those issues, and who better to do it with than someone who studies the U.S.-Mexico, China study person, and of course Ken, who can discuss all issues, but really is a master of anything related to energy economics. We know that's extremely important for trade. Let me just start off with getting a couple of the nuisance questions out of the way. Econ 101 just says that if you impose a tariff, you raise the world price. And when you raise the world price, you're going to get an import. You'll get more U.S. output as the price rises, more firms will produce, consumers will demand a little less, but in total, imports will fall. So if you ask the question, how do imports affect the economy? Well, they're going to raise prices, and they're going to reduce the number of imports, i.e. consumers are going to have less choices. If you ask a more ridiculous question, such as, could we fund all income taxes with tariffs? The answer would be a no, it's completely infeasible. So right now, total imports in 2024 ran about $4 trillion, so you would need tariffs of 60 to 70% to raise $2.6 trillion, which is what the income tax currently brings in. Obviously, if you impose tariffs of 60 to 70%, other countries would retaliate, imports would shrink significantly, and you could never raise $2.6 trillion. It's completely infeasible, and that's the last we're going to talk about that issue. But what is feasible is slight increases in tariffs and raising money to offset other costs. So let's start there, and let's start with Ken Medlock. What would be the impact of just increasing tariffs on the economy if they were done reasonably, even if they were maybe small and across the board, or tariffs on specific goods?
So most of you have probably heard the pundits in the press, and they'll just talk sort of generically, and they'll speak about quantity of exports from Canada, Mexico, or China, and what this could potentially mean. But it's really important to take a step back and understand that you have to look at every single good, every single commodity a little differently. because the opportunities to substitute away from particular goods or commodities when you have a tariff such as what's been proposed, which is literally bilateral in nature, when those are imposed, if there's an opportunity to substitute to a different source for imports, then the impact on the domestic consumer is minimized substantially. One example that I like to lean into, I actually use this in my class, when you think about a tariff on Canadian crude oil imports, for example. Turns out that something like that would have virtually no impact on the price at the pump or the price of a barrel of crude that a refiner in the US is paying. And that's because the elasticity of demand, so the opportunity to substitute away from Canadian crude, is very high. Refiners can actually blend different types of crudes. They can buy other crudes off the international market, which means it has no bearing on the price of crude in the lower 48 or the price of gasoline at the pump. What that basically means is the Canadian producer has to eat the tariff. So yes, the US government still collects the revenue, but all of the burden of the tariff falls on the producer.
Would that be the case for all goods?
Not all goods, no. With Canadian crude, I'm using that example because it's a stark example of where the opportunities for import substitution are pretty robust. When you look at other types of goods and commodities, that's not always the case. So we could talk about produce from Mexico, for example. That's not necessarily the case there, so it would definitely have an impact on the price of produce in grocery stores, things of that nature. When you look at the automotive industry, same exact thing, right? You can't just turn over supply chains and shift away when you don't have a globally fungible commodity like you do with crude oil when you talk about durables in general, like automobiles.
Yeah, so that's a great example. What about the total energy market? So energy is crucial to the economy. What would widespread tariffs on energy products, how would that affect the economy?
Well, it depends on which direction you're going. If you're talking about imports in the United States, it's de minimis, right? And pun intended, right? Everybody's sort of seen the other discussions around. But anyway, the impact on the price at the pump, the impact on the price of natural gas in the United States is minimal at most. That's largely because we are a net exporter of natural gas now. So again, import substitution is pretty simple. We still import volumes via pipeline from Canada, quite substantial volumes, but we're also exporting to Mexico, so those two things basically become a wash. The bigger impact in the energy domain is really on what retaliatory measures are taken by our trading partners. How could that actually impact demand for US produced energy commodities? When we get into oil, again, because it is literally the most globally fungible commodity on the planet, it's a bilateral tariff, so you just reshuffle the deck. It doesn't really have a big impact. Liquefied natural gas is a little bit different because it's not quite as globally fungible, which means bilateral tariffs, particularly with large trading partners, can actually have an impact on production at home. So it just literally depends on the commodity we're talking about.
Interesting. So thinking in terms of the two bilateral tariffs, so the 25% on Canada and the 25% on Mexico, let's turn to Mexico. And Tony, I would like you to opine on what would the effects be if there was a 25% tariff imposed on Mexico? What would Mexico's response be? We saw their response initially, but what do we expect longer term as this issue comes back up? And what are the effects on both countries?
Well, as Ken said, it depends on the particular product that's traded. We know a couple of things. Let me address the agricultural sector because I think that's an important one. The United States gets quite a few of its vegetables and fruits from Mexico. That comes from the Pacific and central Mexico straight through Sonora, Arizona. That's a major port for a lot of the fruits and vegetables from Mexico. Some of them, maybe oranges in Florida and strawberries in California, can be quickly grown here over a short period of time. But for the most part, a lot of them cannot. So that would go, unless the companies are willing to absorb part of the tariff as a tax and lesser profit, that goes straight into the price of the avocados and the strawberries and the cabbages and the cucumbers and all the stuff that comes from Mexico. Quite a bit of our fruits and vegetables come from Mexico. It's kind of a niche market. Alternatively, Mexico is a major importer of U.S. grain, soy, rice, beans, wheat, corn. If Mexico were to impose a tariff in exchange, obviously that also affects the ability of producers in the United States to export that to Mexico, especially if Mexico begins to sort of find other sources, Brazil and other places that they could bring it from. It's a lot more complicated, obviously, because these are very integrated chains. So Mexico would probably have very low leverage because it depends a lot. Only, I think, 12% of Mexican land is arable. So it's a very arid country. It cannot easily grow the grains in the way that the United States can. This is one of the bread baskets of the world, the Midwest, and so it's not easy. But they did threaten tariffs on certain goods, so it would be very difficult. The second thing that I think is important to point out, besides the electrodomestics, TVs, medical equipment, and refrigerators and other things that are made. I think the automotive industry, which Ken referred to, is a really important one and really interesting because over the last 30 years of the USMCA, NAFTA, now USMCA, the automotive industry has fully integrated in such a way that a single vehicle has Canadian parts, has American parts, and has Mexican parts and labor, and those parts and services as well cross back and forth, sometimes several times. So for a company, Ford or Chrysler or any other company that right now finishes the car in Mexico, but they're US parts or Canadian parts or software from the United States and things like that, that would obviously mean something. Companies would have to make different business decisions, and to sort of separate the supply chain in the automotive industry would be very, very complicated. I think it would affect not just Mexican workers and companies, obviously American companies that build those cars. I think there's about 2.5 million cars that come from Mexico to the United States, but we have to understand that those cars are not Mexican cars, they're binational cars. And I think disentangling those chains would be quite difficult and costly. Companies could adjust, they could add the pricing into the ultimate vehicle sticker, but they could also begin to say, well, is it better to go to Arizona or Texas or someplace like that? But that's not going to be done overnight. It takes a while. So it would be very disruptive to certain industries.
It's a great example of where import substitution opportunities are limited. And you mentioned Ford, right? You'd literally be taxing multiple times different components, and that has to work its way through to ultimately the consumer price. And I'll point this out because I think it matters. That could be very damaging for U.S. automakers because the substitution opportunity for customers is to go to Japanese-made vehicles or Korean-made vehicles, and you could actually see a significant impact on the health of the automotive industry.
You're actually helping their main competitors. Yeah, that's a problem. I want to talk a little about politics. The president signed these orders, and almost day one, we had agreements within an hour and a half for Mexico by Monday morning and later in the afternoon for Canada. Did we get anything out of that, Tony? How is this different from what was in place before the order? I just want to understand, what were the dynamics there, and was this all show or was it meaningful?
What is interesting is that when President Trump announced the tariffs in regard to Mexico, he wasn't talking about the trade surplus that Mexico has with the United States. It's quite substantial. I think it's $180 billion or so a year, so it's not small. Usually he's worried about that. But in the Mexican case, which is very different than the Canadian case, where he cited the same concerns as with Mexico, fentanyl and immigration. Very little immigration comes through Canada, very little fentanyl comes through Canada, a fraction of it. So to essentially place those concerns on Canada was kind of odd, and not to mention the trade surplus and say Mexico has to buy additional goods to close that trade deficit with Mexico. It's sort of an odd thing. But at the end of the day, I think it was, I would say, performative. I think it was the president performing what he does, I think, sort of flooding the zone, as they put it, creating chaos so that he can score some political points. But interestingly, just like López Obrador did in 2019, because that was a repeat, I think Sheinbaum in Mexico did exactly the same. It was performance. We're going to send 10,000 National Guard agents to the U.S.-Mexico border. We're going to stop fentanyl. We're going to stop immigration. Immigration is a little bit easier than fentanyl. Fentanyl is a longer-term issue that I think can't be solved overnight. But at the end of the day, it was all performance on both sides because the problem is still there. Fentanyl is still here. Fentanyl is still being produced in Mexico. That's a very flexible industry. We've been in a drug war for, what is it? Richard Nixon declared a drug war in 1972, right? So 60 years later, here, or almost 60 years later, here we are. So it's a very adaptable kind of industry. And at the end of the day, I think when Sheinbaum said, we're going to send 10,000 troops, López Obrador deployed 25,000, it was all performance, because it's not going to solve it overnight. So at the end of the day, I think we're playing a political game and sort of using trade and trade tariffs to play that political game, and I think it's a dangerous way to do it.
Yeah, the executive orders really, we think they talked a lot, at least the chatter afterwards was really focused on the fentanyl and the border security. In the campaign, there was more talk about the U.S. being treated unfairly, and that was in reference to running trade deficits, and I think the implication was that trade deficits were always bad. Is that true, Ken?
No. I don't know where it started. It's really a mercantilist sort of mindset, which we had that fight 200 years ago, but here we are again. That trade deficits are a weight on an economy, and that's not necessarily true, because the reason you run a trade deficit is multifaceted. Largely it's because you can access lower cost goods outside your border, which overall leads to what we refer to as economists as gains from trade, so their welfare improving. And it allows you to reallocate resources domestically to higher productivity assets. It's overall a good thing for growth. In fact, there is an enormity of research that looks at issues of international trade and openness, and it all points to significantly higher long-run growth rates the more open an economy is, so fewer barriers to trade like tariffs. So,
does that have something to do with what offsets the trade deficit? So if the U.S. runs a trade deficit, you get an inflow of capital.
Absolutely.
Right?
Well, that's what makes the inflow of capital attractive. Well, obviously, that's where you typically get better rates of return if you're allocating capital domestically to higher productivity assets. And that's exactly what happens if you move away from things you don't have a comparative advantage in doing. And we import things we don't have a comparative advantage in doing. So it's not necessarily a bad thing.
Excellent. Steve, there was a 10% additional tariff put on China. That one has not been resolved. What's the outlook? We know that China has responded with tariffs of its own put on American goods, and that's very similar to what we saw in 2018 when there was the trade war. Can you walk us through some of that?
Yeah, so they're being, I would say, measured in terms of their reprisal. In choosing some goods that they thought would have some impact were very clear, but probably with the same goal, I would imagine, that President Trump has, which is this is just the beginning of a negotiation, which is kind of how he handled things with China. And as strange as it sounds, that's how the Chinese government works anyway. The Chinese government has done this any number of times to other countries. The Czech Republic, Australia, they just slap big tariffs when they don't like politically what they're doing, slap big tariffs. They do it because they can get away with it. So I would say probably Xi Jinping just kind of looks at it and goes, yeah, I can deal with this. Critically, they also went a little bit further and they said, we're going to actually ban some things. So things related to like lithium. They are deliberately trying to do what we're trying to do to them. We're trying to do them in microchips, whether it's microchip assemblies or machines. We're talking to our allies. This is all under the Biden administration saying, don't send any equipment to China to make all these advanced chips. Let's especially block the things that relate to AI so we can protect the AI industry. And China's saying, well, cool, we'll make sure that anything that relates to you developing your battery industry, we're going to block those as well. And we understand you have a critical shortage of lithium, so we're blocking lithium. And there's other ones too. So they're taking fairly small steps for now, waiting to see, but it's kind of like the beginning of negotiations. I would say I think the more important thing for Chinese consumers and producers, but also Americans as well, it's that extra 10%. Of course is important, but keep in mind there's a lot of stuff that comes in from China, everyday very small items that never actually get taxed, even though they could be, right? And that's because our customs people say if it's under $800, I believe it is, it can just come in and it doesn't actually get inspected. And the Trump administration, my understanding, has said that fentanyl is getting in that way, so we need to shut that down. So there was an interview with customs people saying, if we have to inspect every package that comes in from China and all around the world, we're going to need 10,000 more officers to do this. It's going to gum up the entire system. And I think that's actually how a lot of goods come in from China. We go to Amazon, increasingly we get on Temu, we buy something and it comes, it's small, it's plastic, it's threads, it's a third of our clothing now comes from China, which I think is actually down. Keep in mind though that the Chinese companies have seen this coming. They've been moving their factories out of China, which are too expensive. They've been moving them to Thailand, to other countries. Some factories will go to Mexico, they'll go to other places. Sometimes they'll come to the US if they think that they can do that in the long run. But they've also, just in the short run, they sent huge stockpiles beginning in November especially, to go to people's houses. So if you buy something on Temu now, it's not going to come by probably US mail. It's going to come by this other delivery service that the Chinese companies have actually set up in the United States. It's kind of hinky. It actually kind of works though. But the warehouse it's coming from is probably some Chinese person's apartment somewhere. There's just chock full of shoes, watches, or whatever it is. And it's there to kind of like ride out what they hope is a short-term problem. So that's how they've reacted. And I bought Christmas gifts that were clothing. And I could just tell the way they started arriving in November and December that they'd already figured out ways to get around this, So I ordered some Christmas shirts that were silk, and they obviously were from China. And I got all the messages, it's leaving Poland, and it spent days in customs in Poland, It took 4 weeks to get here because it went through Polish and then American customs, and Poland had nothing to do with this. It was just a transit point. So they had a while to do all kinds of workarounds. And like I said, they're going to avoid Amazon. They're going to go through other distributors. They're going to avoid the U.S. Post Office. They can go through other routes. So I think the answer is also, if the administration wants to have an effective crackdown on this, they're going to have to hire a lot more inspectors and enforcers. The other side of it is, in 2019, I actually gave a talk at DHS to Border and Customs about, they were asking, so what is it when you have the rise of a Chinese middle class? What kind of unique customs problems is that going to create for us? And I said, well, one thing is Chinese medicine, is very expensive. They're looking for other sources of all kinds of things that people who believe in Chinese medicine will buy, so like bear gall, for example. So, heads up to forest rangers in the US for dead bears losing their gall, but also customs people need to be aware for these things leaving the country. And so anyway, that's part of the talk. But I got to talk with the director of that office in 2019, and she said, well, she said, thank you for sharing that. She said, I'm not sure what the impact is going to be, because I estimate that our office alone is going to need another 100 lawyers as well. She said, because anybody you're blocking, we're a legal system. They have recourse to the courts. So anybody who's being blocked in some way, the White House just says block them, but they have recourse through Commerce, through USTR, through DHS. All of us are going to have to lawyer up. So I haven't heard anything in recent days about the Trump administration saying we need to hire hundreds of more lawyers. I don't know if we're going to leave it up to interns like Elon Musk is talking about doing, but I think there's also a capacity problem, especially in China's case with these lower end goods that are actually very common in our lives.
So we did see recently that the U.S. Post Office wasn't going to deliver Chinese goods, and then the next day they removed it.
They removed it.
Was this the? Did they figure out it wasn't going to work, or?
That would be my guess, that they realized that would be, you need a lot more people to try and enforce that.
Everybody can comment on this, but I'm going to start with Tony. He's written a paper recently on it, which is goods flowing, as you mentioned, from China to Mexico and then into the U.S. How important of a problem is that? Is it a problem? Can you discuss that, Tony?
Yes. Gabe Collins, who works with Ken at the Center for Energy Studies, David Gantz, the Will Clayton Fellow on International Economics, and I have been working together on a project on sort of identifying, we call it China in Mexico, because we think that the Chinese are obviously very crafty, very creative, and they know and understand that the USMCA gives privileged access to Mexico to the U.S. market. And so they think, well, if the U.S. is slowly going to be delinking the Chinese economy and excluding the Chinese from access to the American market, then Mexico is inside the wall. It's within the region, and Mexico is this privileged access. So the question there is, how much Chinese investment is there in Mexico? We don't know. In a conversation with Gabe the other day, I think we concluded that there's about 250 companies, but when you look at those companies, they're not all called Fusan or some Chinese name like Fusan. I'm referring to the industrial park in Monterrey that's very obviously Chinese. In certain parts of Mexico, you begin to see Chinese signs in factories and things like that. But most of them are actually not like that. Most of them are a Dutch company, but it's really part of a Chinese holding. They may be in Querétaro, but they're part of a Malaysian holding. But behind that is China. And so to sort of figure out how much of that is China is really becoming difficult. The methodology that we're trying to use is obviously a geolocation, names, so sort of tracking the investment. The result is that Chinese investment in Mexico is very, very tiny. It looks like it's no more than 3% or 4% of foreign investment in Mexico, but we suspect it's a lot higher than that. The problem for Mexico, to come back to the issue of trade with Mexico, is that the Americans can't figure out right now how much Chinese activity, economic activity, is going on in Mexico. And the Chinese, I think, are relying on the fact that, well, if it fulfills the national content or the regional content, 75%, then that goes into the United States. I don't think so. David Gantz argues that there are certain goods that may come through a chair, something simple. Even if it is Chinese and meets the 75% content requirement, it'll come through. But EVs, other technologies like that, in the next renegotiation, 2026, at the end of this year really, the US is going to say it doesn't matter if it meets the content. We're going to do some forensic work, and if it's Chinese in any way, it's not coming through Mexico. Still, the Chinese are going to position themselves very well in Latin America. I recently was in Mexicali, Mexico, and I was in Juarez, Mexico, and you can see Jag and Mac and BYD and all the, you go down the avenues and you see all these Chinese. So they're eating away at the car market. And Mexico is not the only one. So there's going to be some really serious issues. The point is, I think they're going to draw the attention of the Trump administration. And I think that is where real skill is going to come very handy when the USMCA gets renegotiated. President Trump has said that he's going to renegotiate it again. He has to inform Congress 270 days before July 1st, which is the 6-year term. That's, I think, October 1st, 2025. So we're right up against the deadline. And I think China is going to be a major issue in the binational trade. And if Mexico is not very careful, it's going to open itself up to U.S. tariffs or the exclusion of a whole segment of the Mexican economy if it is identified to be Chinese.
Steve, you largely agree with that?
Yeah, and like I said, I think at the end of the day, unless he's changed his mind about an effective government, and he's moving beyond just posturing and initial negotiating steps, if he wants to be effective at doing these things, we're going to actually have to increase the size of the government, especially in certain parts. The muscle parts of like border inspections, more lawyers, because everybody has recourse to the courts. Even Chinese companies that are accused of working for the Chinese military, they can take our Defense Department to court and win, like one did recently. Said, no, we aren't So we're a law and order society, as far as we know. We actually need more lawyers, right?
Yeah, so Ken talked about the gains from trade. So there's actually a cost.
There's a cost to all this.
I'll throw a bit of a wild card in here. I'll frame this with a short anecdote. First thing I'll note is it's odd at first blush to be talking about Mexico, Canada, and China in the same breath, right? Because the historical nature of the relationship with the U.S. is just very different between those three parties. But back in late 2020, when the world was starting to emerge from COVID, I was actually at a dinner, Chatham House rules, so I won't say anybody's name, but there were 13 sitting members of Congress at the table. And the discussion was supposed to be about energy transitions and what we were going to do sort of coming out of COVID to accelerate shifts to lower carbon energy sources. There were 7 R's and 6 D's at the table, scheduled for about 2 hours. First course came in, all the pleasantries were done. We started the conversation. About 15 minutes into the conversation, the subject of China came up. We spent the next 2.5 hours talking about nothing but things related to China, got away from energy entirely. But the most remarkable thing about the discussion is that nobody at the table disagreed. That was eye-opening to me. It became very clear at that point in time that China is the bogeyman, literally. And when you go to DC, nothing's changed. So when we think about what's going to happen with regard to how Trump will approach negotiations with China, he will have the full backing of the U.S. Congress, regardless of which side of the aisle you sit on. And if you don't believe it, just think about what happened with the Trump tariffs. When Biden took office, he increased them. It is a different discussion when you bring China into it. And the fact that China is actually finding its way into countries like Mexico, Canada, it presents a different kind of obstacle that, again, the full weight of the U.S. Congress, not just the administration, is going to aggressively pursue. So don't underestimate what this means. It's pretty significant.
I want to add something about Mexico as well, because Trump has been doing a lot of issue linkage. I mean, he really knows how to link one thing to the other. But I do have to say, Mexico's strategy, even though it has paid off in the short term, he offered 25,000 National Guard agents in 2019 and Trump backed down a little bit. Sheinbaum offered 10,000 and then he kind of backed down from that for 30 days. That still hangs as a sword of Damocles over Canada and Mexico. But what I think is foolish in Mexico's strategy is that it has continuously denied genuine U.S. concerns. Yes, I am pro-immigration. But I can tell you, there is a problem with immigration. We have to solve it. It has to be legal. I criticize Congress because there has to be new paths and perhaps even increased caps for legal immigration. They don't want to change the immigration system, even though it needs to be changed. And so the immigrants are coming irregularly through Mexico. And Mexico for a long time ignored that. So it's a genuine concern. Fentanyl is a genuine concern. 107,000 Americans are dying of overdoses of fentanyl every year in this country. I think it's kind of come down in the last few months, maybe a year, to under 100,000. But that's a lot of folks dying of fentanyl. For a long time, Scheinbaum said, Mexico doesn't produce any fentanyl. Fentanyl is not produced here. And the evidence was all over the place. So Mexico has to step up the game in acknowledging that there are genuine concerns coming from the Trump administration. That, I think, it's a valid point that he's making. I don't know if it should be dealt with through trade, but it is a valid concern. I think for a long time, Mexico has refused to acknowledge that. So in the paper that I published last week, saying a framework has to be in place before cooperation can happen. I don't know which, is the chicken or the egg, but I think denying that the U.S. has genuine concerns is a problem. And I think what Trump has done is use trade to say, here are some concerns, you have to address them. The final thing is, I'm afraid that he settles for an offer of additional National Guard troops to the border, and the problem remains. I think immigration is kind of getting there, but fentanyl, I think it's a longer-term issue because Mexico has dismantled effectively its capacity to fight organized crime, fentanyl producers, and labs. That's not going to be an easy thing for Mexico to fulfill. And so in 30 days, well, less than that now, we'll see whether Trump is satisfied.
Interesting. So another point along those lines is going to the 2018 trade war, there were tariffs placed on washing machines and dryers. And that was partly to support the workers in the upper Midwest whose companies were having to compete with Chinese companies, and they were losing. They were in fear of being shuttered. And so Trump steps in and places tariffs, saves the companies, gaining popular votes in important places in America in terms of an election. But at the same time, China returned with tariffs on American produce and farmers, wheat and corn, and we ended up subsidizing, so we ended up making emergency payments of about $92 billion to American farmers to offset the cost of the retaliation by China. So, I think my point there, because it's amazing how economists usually disagree on a lot of topics, but when it comes to trade, there's been a lot of agreement that tariffs are bad, but yet we can't forget that the gains from trade are positive, but there are winners and losers in trade. So if you trade and certain industries move, then the people who worked in those industries are the losers.
That's why we call them net gains from trade.
Net gains from trade, exactly.
So one thing I also want to point out is, in addition to this whole, especially U.S. economy, Chinese economy, I think it's becoming clear that both of them are preparing for the possibility that our consumers won't be in touch with their consumers, and their producers are preparing for that. And I think the interesting thing about that is that China is going much farther, literally in saying, fine, we'll deal with the rest of the world. And China is moving to increase the number of free trade agreements with many more countries around the world. They're also, because there's been a huge fall off in tourism in China, local governments have been coming up with all kinds of things to increase the number of foreigners coming in, foreign investment coming in, making it easier and easier and easier. So now as an American, even an American, you don't need a visa to do a short trip to China. You do a transit visa, allows you 10 days. If you're from Malaysia, you don't even need a visa to go to China, okay? And that's actually amazing if you think about it, right? Because they're going to end up with Malaysians living there because overstaying their visas and things like that. And so that shows you kind of both how desperate they are, but it shows you how easily they have an alternative to using us to kind of keep their economy growing. There's an enormous middle class growing in other countries around the world. Indonesia's the fourth largest population and a very large growing middle class. They have serious border problems over gas, and things like that with China, and yet they still keep turning to China for any number of things and tightening their relationship. Even though Indonesia probably doesn't really want to do that, they're kind of stuck going with it. China's model for development is also building all these cargo container ports. When President Biden was in APEC down in Brazil recently, he criticized Peru, I think, was put in a new cargo container port. And everybody in Peru's fine, you come up with something that we can have. We're not offering an alternative. And China realizes if we set up a cargo container port, it just facilitates all this Chinese trade going into there, but it also opens up all these Peruvian producers can now send things not just to China, they can send things to the United States as well. And there also can be a whole workaround of Chinese goods going through Peru. So China is playing a much more active role than we currently are, because we're kind of withdrawing from that role of free trade, leading all of these things. And I kind of wonder, are we in a way doing a little bit what Japan also has done with itself? Japan was a leader in so many things, but it's now at the point where you want to do business with Japan, you have to deal with their complicated banking system, and it's the same with the United States. If you're in another developing country, you want to deal with Americans, you have to deal with Visa and MasterCard, and nobody wants to deal with Visa and MasterCard. They'd rather deal with Alipay and WePay and the Chinese ones, because they're using smartphones, probably Huawei smartphones. They're using online banking, doing everything through their cell phone. And it's a whole Chinese system that's so much more amenable because it's low cost. In that sense, I would just want to say they're eating our lunch in the future economies that we probably should be paying attention to.
That's a good point. I'm going to ask one final question. You can each make a comment. There's a book called The End of the World is Just the Beginning, and it discusses this idea of the end of globalization as we start to kind of pull and look within. And what are y'all's thoughts on where we go? Are we going to go back towards a world where we have a more global economy, or are we going to put up walls and have more of, say, a North American economy, or are we really going to shut ourselves off even smaller than that? Where do you think we're headed, given what you see right now?
I would say I don't see a lot of discussion of long term on either side, particularly when dealing with China. And China is playing a long game, whereas we tend to play by our political system short games. So that's part of our problem. And like I said, we need to have longer term consideration of what sectors should we be competing with China? Where should we be working with our allies? Because we've had some success with that. And China doesn't have a lot of allies. It's not very popular. Xi Jinping's not popular. But on the other hand, the goods and the services they're providing are cheaper than the things, but they're high quality than what we're doing. And so right now, China looks more welcoming to the rest of the world. I think we need to rethink, it's okay maybe to do these one-on-one negotiations with China to get them to back down on some things. But I would say the bigger issue is work with our allies to collectively force China to be more reciprocal.
Sounds like you're saying America first maybe should be America together, that we need to work more collectively with ourselves before
that would help.
Yeah.
I think I want to fall back on the political science aspect of it. If the United States gives up its primacy in the world, I think it'll be by choice. It doesn't have to. I think it's still, in many, many ways, the indispensable nation. I don't think China is where the United States is. It's going to be a long time before China can truly compete with the United States. But there are things that we do. There are mistakes. I'm watching and I'll give you this particular instance because it's very vivid right now. We're dismantling USAID. That's $60 billion. In our economy, that's nothing. Some infrastructure project in California can cost $60 billion. So to me, to all of a sudden tell the world, we don't care about fighting disease in Africa, we don't care about aiding projects in agriculture in villages in South America and things like that, when the cost is so low and build so much goodwill, I think it's just giving it up for practically nothing. And it's not going to be a great savings to the U.S. government. It's less than 1% of the federal budget, not the GDP, the federal budget. So it's a lot of goodwill, it's a lot of leadership, a lot of presence for very, very little cost. So I think at the end of the day, if this is the path the United States is going to take, then we are going to be more and more isolated. People are going to look to the United States for leadership. I don't know where they look to. I'm not sure that China is going to be the option. I don't really think so. But I think they're certainly going to say, well, it's not the U.S., so what is it? And the world, I think, without a United States engaged and truly at the center of it, will be a much more chaotic world.
So are we moving away from an era of globalization? I'll just very flatly say no. It's sometimes easy to cherry pick examples and sort of make broad, grand prognostications, but when you look at the activity of publicly traded companies that are based in the United States that don't have any U.S. government ownership around the world, it's robust. That is by far one of the most significant spheres of influence that I guarantee you people in the U.S. State Department fully recognize, right? But that's not something the U.S. government does, right? That's something that private enterprise does. And U.S. private enterprise is still very engaged internationally, and that's not going to change because there are opportunities all over the world. The U.S. government has very masterfully been able to engage in statecraft, have very significant conversations around geopolitical issues behind things that they have no ownership in. I, of course, am in the Center for Energy Studies. Energy is a prime example of this. Back during Hillary Clinton's term as Secretary of State, for the first time ever, on the U.S. State Department's website, in particular in the Bureau of Energy Resources, appeared the words, "The U.S. is an energy superpower." Now, I just want you to think about that, because what it means is that every conversation U.S. State Department officials were having everywhere around the world started with, what's happening with shale? When will oil be exportable? What's going on with natural gas? We want access to this commodity that is free of government interference. Right? That's a really remarkable thing that has had massive implications for U.S. foreign policy. So don't think that globalization is over. USAID, you said it, it's a small fraction of overall the sphere of influence. As a matter of fact, in many cases, if you look at the full spectrum of what U.S. and U.S.-based companies are doing, it's rounding error. So I wouldn't say that it's going to reduce influence. I would say that it provides some very important services that really shouldn't be taken away, because it does actually help the U.S. project into different places around the world. But I think it's important to recognize the full breadth of what the U.S. actually brings to the world economy, which is substantial.
Ken, Steve, and Tony, thank you very much. It's been very informative. Baker Briefing is brought to you by the Baker Institute for Public Policy, which provides meaningful, nonpartisan analysis on the most critical challenges facing the U.S., Texas, and the world. This episode was produced by Karina Zamel with support from Maggie Siganova. AV production was led by Kevin Young. You can learn more about our work by visiting bakerinstitute.org. Thanks for listening.